Imagine waking up one morning and realizing you cannot move, not paralyzed in the way we usually think about it. Your heart is beating, your lungs are filling with air, your eyes are open and you can see the ceiling above you, the window across the room, the nurse walking past the door. You can hear everything, the creak of the floorboards, the distant sound of a city going about its day. You can feel hunger, you can feel cold, you can feel fear, but you cannot speak. You cannot lift your hand. You cannot turn your head. You are completely, utterly locked inside yourself with no way out. And the most horrifying part is this: nobody knows you are still in there. Now imagine that this does not last a day, or a week, or even a year. Imagine that this lasts for 40 years. This is not a thought experiment. This is not a horror story someone invented. This happened. It happened to real people, with real names and real families who slowly, one by one, stopped coming to visit. It happened to children who froze in the middle of growing up and woke as elderly strangers in their own bodies. It happened to soldiers who survived the battlefield only to lose the war inside their own minds. And it happened on a scale so enormous that it should be one of the most studied, most mourned, most remembered events in all of modern history. Instead, almost nobody knows about it. Between 1916 and the early 1920s, a wave of neurological devastation swept across the world. It moved silently. It moved globally. It arrived in hospitals in Vienna and Paris, then London and New York, then Moscow and Buenos Aires, and everywhere it arrived, it left behind the same impossible thing. People who were alive but absent. People whose bodies continued to function, but whose connection to the world had been severed as completely as a cut wire. Doctors called it Encephalitis lethargica. The newspapers, when they covered it at all, called it the sleeping sickness. Both names are almost insultingly gentle for what it actually was. What it actually was is something medicine has never fully confronted. Not then, not now. And the reason it has never been confronted is the same reason you almost certainly never heard about it in school, never saw a documentary about it, never encountered it in any of the history you were taught. The truth behind the sleeping sickness is too uncomfortable. It points in directions that powerful institutions in the early 20th century could not afford to follow. And so it was quietly filed away. The patients were quietly institutionalized. The research was quietly defunded. And within a generation, one of the most profound neurological catastrophes in human history became a footnote, a curiosity, a paragraph in a specialized medical textbook that nobody reads. That ends today. Because once you understand what actually happened to the people who fell asleep in 1916, you will never look at the world around you the same way again. And that is not dramatic claim made to keep you watching. It is simply the truth. Because the sleeping sickness is not just a story about the past. It is a mirror held up to the present. And what it reflects is deeply, personally unsettling. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin with a person. Let us call her Maria. Maria is 26 years old in the winter of 1917. She lives in a city that has been transformed by war. The streets outside her window are quieter than they used to be because most of the young men are gone. The factories run at all hours now. The sky over the industrial quarter glows orange at night. The air smells of coal and metal and something sharper underneath that nobody has a name for yet. Maria works in one of those factories, 12-hour shifts assembling components whose purpose she is never told. She comes home tired in a way that sleep does not fix. She comes home with a faint headache that has become so constant she has stopped noticing it. Then one morning, Maria Bull wakes up and something is wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not wrong in the way that sends you running to a doctor, just wrong in a quiet, creeping way. Her movements feel slow, as though she is walking through water. Her thoughts arrive slightly behind where she expects them to be. She mentions it to nobody because everyone is tired, everyone is struggling. The war has swallowed the world and fatigue has become the universal condition of civilian life. A week passes, then two. The slowness deepens. Maria begins to fall asleep at odd moments, briefly, suddenly, as though something is interrupting her. Her supervisor notices, her sister notices. Maria herself notices but cannot explain it and cannot stop it. Then one afternoon, sitting at her workstation, Maria simply stops. She does not fall. She does not convulse. She does not cry out. She sits completely still, eyes open, breathing steadily, and she does not respond when her name is called. She does not flinch when someone touches her shoulder. She simply sits. The factory foreman sends for a doctor. The doctor sends for an ambulance. Maria is carried to a hospital bed, and there she remains for the next 11 years. Here is what the doctors who examined Maria would write in their notes. Eyes open and tracking movement, pupils reactive to light, respiratory and cardiac function normal, no fever, no visible signs of infection, no response to verbal commands. Patient appears wakeful but is unresponsive to stimulation. Here is what the doctors would not write, because they did not know and could not imagine. Maria was awake. Maria was listening to every word they said. Maria was terrified and could not tell anyone. Maria heard her sister come to visit 3 times a week for the first year, and then twice a week, and then once a month, and then not at all. Maria heard the nurses discuss her case in the doorway and use her name in the past tense as though she were already gone. Maria felt the days accumulate into months, and the months into years, and she experienced every single one of them in a silence so complete it was indistinguishable from burial. This is the reality that history chose not to examine, not the medical statistics, not the case classifications, not the theoretical debates about viral origins. The reality of what it was actually like to be inside one of these bodies, frozen, present, and forgotten. Maria is a composite drawn from documented testimonies, because in the 1960s, something extraordinary happened that briefly forced the world to confront the truth it had spent 40 years avoiding. A neurologist named Oliver Sacks began treating long-term encephalitis lethargica patients with a new drug that targeted dopamine pathways in the brain. And some of those patients woke up, not gradually, not partially, suddenly, completely, and with a clarity that was almost impossible to comprehend. People who had not spoken in decades began to speak. People who had not moved began to move. And what they said when they could finally speak was not what anyone expected. They were not confused. They were not lost. They were furious. They were grieving. They were disoriented by a world that had continued without them. But their minds were intact. Their personalities were preserved. Their memories stopped precisely at the moment they had frozen and picked up again the instant the drug began to work. One patient looked at her own hands and said she did not recognize them. She was in her 70s. She remembered being in her 30s. Another patient asked where his brother was. His brother had died 15 years earlier. Another looked out the window at a street she had known all her life and could not reconcile the building that stood where her memory insisted there had been an empty lot. These awakenings are documented. They are not disputed by medicine. Oliver Sacks wrote about them with extraordinary care and honesty in his book about these patients. And what those awakenings proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, is something that should have rewritten everything we thought we knew about the sleeping sickness. They proved that these patients had been conscious all along, not partially conscious, not dreaming, fully, completely, experientially conscious, present without participation, aware without agency, alive inside a locked room with no door. Think about what that means. Think about what it means for the 40 years before those treatments existed. Think about the thousands of people who were never treated, who aged and died in exactly that condition, who spent lifetimes trapped in that silence and were buried without anyone ever knowing they had been awake the whole time. And then ask yourself this: why did the world not want to know? Because the world did not want to know. That is not a speculation. That is the documented history. Research into encephalitis lethargica declined sharply in the 1930s. Funding disappeared. Institutions stopped dedicating resources to long-term care. Medical interest moved elsewhere. The patients were absorbed into the general population of the institutionalized, the chronic, the quietly warehoused. And the question of what had caused the epidemic, the question that should have been the obsession of an entire generation of researchers, was essentially abandoned. That abandonment was not an accident, it was a choice. And to understand why that choice was made, we need to look very closely at the world in which the sleeping sickness emerged. Because when you examine the timing and the geography and the specific populations that were affected, the epidemic stops looking random very quickly. The sleeping sickness arrived in 1916, not 1914 when the war began, not 1918 when influenza swept the world. 1916. the precise moment when industrial warfare reached its full and terrible expression, the precise moment when chemical weapons were being deployed at scale for the first time in human history, the precise moment when electrical infrastructure was expanding rapidly through the cities of Europe and North America, when radio transmission moved from experimental to operational, when industrial toxins were entering air and water and soil at concentrations the natural world had never before contained. The world of 1916 was, for the human nervous system, an entirely new kind of place. And the human nervous system had not been consulted about the changes. Look at where the epidemic concentrated: urban populations, industrial workers, soldiers stationed near artillery lines and communications equipment, children in cities, the young and the physiologically vulnerable. Now look at who it largely spared: rural populations, people distant from industrial centers, communities whose daily environments had not been radically transformed in the preceding decade. This is not the distribution of a disease spread by human contact. A contagious illness radiates outward from sources. It follows travel routes, population density, physical proximity. Encephalitis lethargica did not do this. It appeared in clusters that had no clear chain of transmission. It struck people who had never met each other in neighborhoods that had no obvious epidemiological connection. It behaved, in the language of medicine, as though something ambient had changed rather than something contagious had spread. And no pathogen was ever found. This is the fact that the official explanation has never satisfactorily addressed. Decades of research, modern laboratory techniques applied to preserve tissue samples, no consistent virus, no bacteria, no genetic marker pointing to a biological agent. An epidemic of this scale, this global reach, this devastating specificity left no biological fingerprint of infection. That is not a minor footnote. That is the central mystery of the entire event, and it has never been resolved. What was found, consistently, in the brains of those who did not survive, was damage concentrated in specific and precise locations: the midbrain, the basal ganglia, the brainstem. These are not the regions you would expect inflammation from a general viral infection to target. These are ancient regions, evolutionarily ancient, developed over millions of years to regulate the most fundamental states of human existence: wakefulness and sleep, movement and stillness, motivation and withdrawal, the ability to initiate action, the will to engage with the world. Whatever struck those brains did not strike randomly. It struck the control switches, the on and off mechanisms of conscious participation in life, and it did so with a precision that should have told researchers immediately that they were not looking at a conventional infection. They were looking at something that had interfered with fundamental neurological architecture in a targeted and specific way. Why did it interfere in exactly this way? Here, the most honest answer is that we still do not fully know, but we know considerably more than the official record acknowledges. We know that the regions of the brain most damaged by encephalitis lethargica are among the most sensitive to chemical and electromagnetic disruption. We know that several of the industrial compounds introduced into civilian environments in the years before 1916 are now understood to have significant neurotoxic properties. We know that certain frequencies of electromagnetic exposure have been demonstrated in modern research to affect sleep regulation and dopamine function, the precise systems the sleeping sickness dismantled. We know that the human brain, confronted with overwhelming and unprecedented environmental stressors, does not always respond by breaking down. Sometimes it responds by shutting down. There is a difference. Shutdown is strategic. It is the nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do when faced with conditions beyond its operational tolerance. It withdraws. It reduces its engagement with the external world to protect the internal architecture. It sleeps. This is not a fringe hypothesis. Modern neurology recognizes this mechanism in individuals: dissociation, catatonia, trauma-induced neurological withdrawal. These are documented, accepted, clinically recognized responses to extreme overwhelm. The sleeping sickness may have been the first and only time in recorded history that this individual response occurred at population scale. A mass neurological retreat from a world that had changed too fast, too violently, and too completely for the biological systems it housed to adapt. And here is where the story stops being about 1916. Here is where it becomes about right now, Because the world you live in today is not the world of 1916 in most obvious ways. The specific chemicals of industrial warfare are not in your air. The particular convergence of early electromagnetic experimentation and mass chemical exposure does not surround you in the same form. But something else does. Something that the sleeping sickness, if it could speak to you across a century of silence, might recognize. You live inside a constant stream of information that never stops. From the moment you wake until the moment you force yourself to sleep, your nervous system is processing. Notifications, headlines, social feeds updating in real time. The ambient knowledge that somewhere in the world something is always happening that requires your awareness. Messages that expect responses. Images calibrated to hold your attention. Video designed to prevent you from looking away. Sound engineered to keep you engaged. And underneath all of it, a faint but persistent hum of anxiety that comes from being permanently connected to every crisis, every conflict, and every tragedy on Earth simultaneously. Your nervous system was not built for this. That is not a moral judgment. It is a biological fact. The human brain evolved in an environment of limited information, clear physical threats, social groups of roughly 150 people, and long periods of sensory quiet. The environment you actually inhabit bears almost no resemblance to that. And the gap between what your nervous system was designed for and what it is currently asked to process is widening every year. The symptoms of that gap have names now. Burnout, dissociation, emotional numbness, executive dysfunction, the inability to concentrate, the feeling of going through the day in a fog, the experience of being present in a room but not fully there, the inability to feel things at the intensity you once felt them, the exhaustion that sleep does not repair, the sense of watching your own life from a slight distance rather than fully inhabiting it. These are not character flaws. They are not laziness or weakness or a generation failing to cope. They are signals. The same kind of signals that Maria's slowing movements were signals in the winter of 1917, before anyone understood what they meant. The sleeping sickness reached a threshold. Millions of nervous systems, pushed past a particular point of tolerance by a particular convergence of environmental stressors, disengaged completely. The withdrawal was total and catastrophic. What we see in the present is not that. Let us be honest about that distinction. But the direction of the pressure is familiar, and the mechanism being strained is the same one. The question is not whether we are in 1916. We are not. The question is whether we have learned anything from what 1916 revealed. Whether the knowledge that human consciousness is not infinitely resilient, that it can be overwhelmed, that it will protect itself by withdrawing if it has no other option, has been absorbed into how we build the world. Whether the people who fell asleep and were never properly mourned or understood or investigated have been honored in any real way. The answer, if we are honest, is no. The sleeping sickness is not taught in schools. It is not part of the standard historical narrative of the 20th century, despite affecting millions of people on every inhabited continent. There is no international memorial. There is no annual remembrance. There is no cultural reckoning with what it meant that an entire generation of people spent decades in conscious paralysis while the world decided not to ask what had caused it, and that forgetting is not neutral. It has consequences. Because forgetting the sleeping sickness means forgetting the lesson it encoded in the worst possible way. The lesson that consciousness is not separate from environment, that the mind does not exist in a sealed biological chamber immune to what surrounds it, that what you breathe and hear and feel and are exposed to and are asked to process and are never given silence from shapes the neurological substrate on which everything else you experience depends. The patients who woke briefly in the 1960s and found a world unrecognizable and unreachable, who greeted family members who had died and reached for objects that had been removed decades earlier, who wept not only from confusion but from a grief so compressed and delayed that it seemed to come from somewhere outside time. Those patients were trying to tell us something about what it costs to be erased, about what it means when the systems that connect a mind to the world are severed and nobody asks why, about the silence that exists inside a person that no clinical label adequately describes. We owe them that story, not as a footnote, not as a medical curiosity, as a genuine reckoning with what happened and why it was allowed to be forgotten. And we owe ourselves the honesty of looking at that story clearly and asking what it means for how we live now. Not with fear, not with the paralysis that comes from believing the situation is hopeless, but with the sober recognition that the nervous system you inhabit is not an infinite resource, that it has a point of tolerance, that the signals it sends when that tolerance is being approached, the fatigue, the fog, the flatness, the dissociation, the sense of not quite being present even while you are physically there, those signals are worth listening to, not pathologizing, not medicating into silence, listening to. Because the alternative is a world that learned nothing from the rows of still bodies in the hospitals of 1917. A world that looked at millions of people who had fallen asleep rather than asking what in their environment had made wakefulness impossible, chose instead to file them away and move on. The sleeping sickness did not end because someone found a cure. It did not end because science triumphed over a pathogen. It ended, best we can tell, because the specific configuration of stressors that had overwhelmed those particular nervous systems at that particular historical moment gradually shifted. The war ended. Some chemical exposures reduced. Infrastructure evolved. The sheer concentrated intensity of industrial warfare in the first decade of mass electrification passed. And as it passed, the trigger conditions for the mass neurological withdrawal passed with it. What replaced them were different conditions. Conditions that built more slowly, distributed differently, and produced symptoms less dramatic and more diffuse, and therefore even easier to normalize. The sleepers of 1916 were impossible to ignore because their stillness was visible and absolute. The disconnection that characterizes so much of contemporary experience is invisible precisely because it occurs inside people who are still moving, still speaking, still producing, still functioning in every external measure, while something essential quietly recedes. That is perhaps the most important thing the sleeping sickness can teach us now. Not that we are about to experience another epidemic of literal frozen consciousness, but that the withdrawal of genuine presence from a life does not always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks perfectly normal from the outside. Sometimes the locked room is invisible to everyone, including the person inside it. Maria, in the winter of 1917, could not tell anyone what was happening to her. She sat in that factory and then in that hospital bed, and the silence between her experience and the world's understanding of her experience was total and permanent. Most of us are not Maria, but most of us know something about the experience of being present without being fully present, of going through the motions while something essential is somewhere else, of smiling and responding and existing in rooms while the part of you that actually inhabits experience watches from further and further away. Those who fell asleep in 1916 are not a metaphor. They were real people who suffered in ways that went unacknowledged for decades. But what happened to them is also a warning, encoded in history by the most extreme possible version of a mechanism that does not need to reach its most extreme expression to matter. The sleeping sickness asks us to take the nervous system seriously, to take the environments we build seriously, to take the signals of overload seriously before they reach the threshold at which the only response available is withdrawal. It asks us to remember the people who paid the price for a world that did not understand those things and chose, when confronted with evidence, to look away. It asks us to look. We started this investigation with a question about what it felt like to be trapped inside a frozen body while the world moved on without you. We end it with a different question, one that is less about the past and more about the space between yesterday and tomorrow that we are all currently inhabiting. What are we willing to hear? The bells of Encephalitis Lethargica rang in 1916. They rang in hospital wards across 5 continents. They rang in the silence of people who were awake and could not say so. They rang in the brief terrified awakenings of patients 4 decades later who found themselves old in a world they did not recognize. They rang in the clinical notes of doctors who described symptoms they could not explain, and then, because explanation was not available, chose not to pursue the question further. History heard those bells and decided not to answer. That is the real mystery of the sleeping sickness. Not what caused it, though that question remains genuinely unresolved and genuinely important. The real mystery is what it reveals about us, about what we are willing to know, about what we are willing to carry, about whose suffering we can afford to remember and whose we cannot. Those who fell asleep in 1916 are owed an answer to that mystery, and perhaps so are we.